All right, it looks like it's the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's the new academic year, so for anyone who doesn't know who I am, I'm Brian Appavu. I'm one of the neurologists and epileptologists that works here at Phoenix Children's currently, and also has a particular interest in ICU monitoring and medicine and neurological care, as well as EEG. So I was asked to present on Grand Rounds today, and I wanted to select a topic that one is interesting to me, but also wanted to bear in mind, I wanted to pick something that's not necessarily a very specific niche, but something that has a broader depth of and overlaps with a lot of the different disciplines that regard the neurosciences. So decided to talk about consciousness. So the title of my talk is Consciousness, Metaphysics, Coma, and Beyond. So, all right, so I have some disclosures, most pretty much in the form of research. I am funded through the Pediatric Epilepsy Research Foundation and have received funding from University of Arizona Valley Research Partnership and Innovative Neuroscience Kids Foundation for doing some research regarding consciousness research, which I will touch on as one part of this. And I've received funding from other organizations that are not a part of this talk. So some of the objectives I'm going to talk about is I'm going to describe consciousness as it has been historically delineated with the domains of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience, describe emerging methods of investigating for consciousness and patients where there is suspicion for something we call covert consciousness or cognitive motor dissociation. And then I'm going to discuss challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. This is a neuroscience grand round, so trying to integrate different disciplines toward our knowledge gaps in the study of consciousness. I want to preface that there is absolutely no possible way in a 60-minute grand round for me to go through the entire topic of consciousness, all the breadth, depth, and glory that it has across multiple domains. There is simply no way, nor will I claim to be an expert in all of the different elements. What I hope to do is give you perhaps my perspective and a journey of the areas that have been interesting to me, both from even before I entered medicine to where things have taken me to this point, and where my interests are moving forward. So what do we do? So the audience here, you guys, we are, we're clinical caregivers, and we have a focus in the neurosciences. The roles that we have taken in our career and the expertise that we have developed over the course of our lifetime and professional life has been centered on improving the care and outcomes for children and patients with conditions that either cause direct disease or increase the risk of disease to the nervous system. To the extent that we use empirical reasoning, nervous system represents the biological and energy substrate for what is our conscious experience. Consciousness is omnipresent in our work. It doesn't matter whether we're focusing on coma, spasticity, mental health, epilepsy, headaches, or peripheral neuropathies. When we aim to help patients with neurologic disease, when we focus on improving their quality of life, our work fundamentally carries some focus towards what we call the conscious experience. So there are hard questions that we don't have full answers to. We just have gotten better and better explanations, but not definitive answers. What is consciousness? Can it be measured? Can it be simulated? What frameworks can help us in our responsibility as clinicians in the modern age within the neurosciences to help navigate through the evolving landscape that we currently are in? So it's important to start with probably our initial concepts of consciousness, and this is a lot of it comes from the pre-scientific method. And we have, this is a diagram from ancient civilization from an old cave where one of the first demonstrations of a conscious experience or a thought about consciousness was sort of observed, where you have an ancient cave drawing where we found evidence that points to some of our early ancestors recognizing a separation of dreams and the mind. So we have early evidence from prehistorical days telling us that that our ancient ancestors have thought about this. and this evolved sort of in the concept of in the realm of metaphysics, before the pre-scientific age, before we started to test hypotheses through rigorous methods. We contemplated what it means to be conscious, and and whether what they observe in our life is the things that we observe are true and real, or are perhaps could be illusions. How do we sort of ascertain this? So this is a diagram reflecting what's known as Plato's cave. For anybody who's looked at this topic, this is the whole idea is that Plato had when he described the Plato's cave, is that there were prisoners for people to imagine themselves as prisoners in a cave where they're chained to a wall and there is a fire behind them, and they can see on the reflection with the light on the wall of the cave a variety of objects. And to them, they think they may, if they have no other way of observing the world other than through this chained experience, they think that those objects are real and are reflective of what they can be. So in this diagram, a horse, a bird, a circle, a ring, different things. But it's only when the prisoner is able to exit the cave and are they able to see that what their initial observations were not what they thought they were, and to essentially escape illusion and understand the world for what it is. So this is, so Plato really brought out the allegory of the cave to sort of reflect on the fact that we have a perception of what exists in the world, but we are susceptible to illusions to this. Now, this is this fascination of metaphysics and Plato's caves has played its role in art and philosophy and a lot of provocative thinkers. If you watch The Matrix, it's really the movie The Matrix is a lot of it is built around the concept of Plato's cave. There are modern philosophical writers who are a bit provocative, who have a variety of statements that they describe in terms of this. So one is John McKenna. He says that you never leave the movie screen. Everything happens on the screen. It's all a projection. So metaphysics has definitely played its role and continues to play its role in our perception of what it means to be conscious. René Descartes brought out in Passion of the Soul and Description of the Human Body the text where he thought about the concept of consciousness and what we now think of as dualism, this idea that the body is separate from the mind. And so we get his work has led to a lot of different concepts, and one of the major ones be his statement cogito ergo sum, which is the self-evident statement, I think therefore I am. In his mind and in his work contemplating a lot of different things, this was a fundamental truth that he would be able to describe about what consciousness is really in a self-evident statement that we all can say, I think therefore I am. We exist because we know that we exist simply because we think and we manifest with our thoughts. And beyond that, how do we take empirical reasoning and understand what's real and what's not real? That is something that philosophers have been challenged with. But we've had historical challenges to understanding these higher level abilities of human thought. And as we've entered the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and we started to test different theories about the nervous system, the brain, and the substrates that deliver consciousness, we start to think about how we understand higher abilities of human thought. How is the brain self-sufficient to generate complex internal thoughts, or how are we able to have concept formation? And how is the brain self-sufficient to report such internal thoughts using speech? So this raises question: how do we think, and what is the I that I is thinking when we think of things like cogito or ergo sum, or I think therefore I am? Historically, after in the post-Enlightenment period, we've had scientists and philosophers, psychologists, all talking about consciousness and trying to identify if there's a part of the body or brain that exists. But when we observe historically, there's a lack of coherence of great thinkers regarding the nature of thought. Michel de Montaigne in 1850 wrote that Hippocrates and Heracles lodged in the ventricle of the brain. Democritus, Aristotle thought it was throughout the body. Epicurus in the stomach. The Stoics within and around the heart. Empedocles within the blood. Galen thought it was each part of the body that had its own soul, and Strato lodged it between the eyebrows. And a lot of this these challenges have continued to emerge into the 20th century. And George Miller, a psychologist, famously wrote that consciousness in 1962, that consciousness is a word worn by a million tongues. Maybe we should ban the word for a decade or two until we develop more precise terms using the several uses for which consciousness now obscures. It's a term, it's a concept that is used in different perspectives, domains across philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, and everyone looks at it a little bit differently and describes it a little bit differently. So why do we encounter the core medical physical concepts and questions of the core medical physical questions of consciousness remain unanswered despite everything that we've studied and learned. We've gotten better studies, we've gotten better explanations for phenomena, but so how we extend beyond cogito ergo sum in a metaphysical realm is still challenged. The scientific method has not at this point addressed those sort of metaphysical arguments that are there. Nevertheless, at its core, the scientific method has allowed us to do something that we all value, particularly as clinicians. We want to solve problems. We want to help other people. We want to improve the care of those who have issues that regard the conscious experience. In our hospital and our clinic, we in one form or another aim toward helping patients that go through this. This was a paper from Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, which had to do with the concept of covert awareness or covert consciousness, which I'll get to later in this talk. But as we have thought about this concept that there are patients in an ICU or that appear comatose that have some degrees of consciousness, how do we describe what they're going through? And this was a systematic review that just described that there's a ton of different words that we're using in the medical literature. Cognitive motor dissociation, akinetic mutism, covert awareness, covert consciousness, covert cortical processing, functional locked-in syndrome. We're using a bunch of terms in the literature, not in a standardized manner, and therefore, when you search the literature on this, you don't even see the same terms. So this comes down to some of this comes down to our lack of understanding of how we describe what consciousness is, and what sort of constitutes it, and what we can do. This also has some regard to epilepsy. When it comes to epilepsy, we have used epilepsy classifications in terms of, particularly for focal seizures, we differentiate them in terms of their impact on consciousness. But when you look at the history of the epilepsy classifications through the International League Against Epilepsy, consciousness has evolved in terms of how it was described. When the ILAE first came up with this classification in the 60s and 70s, there was the term consciousness was used, but it wasn't really given a concrete definition. And then through the 80s, and then more in the recent 10 years or so, we've started to try to develop operational definitions for what consciousness is, and these have to do a little bit more with the ideas of responsiveness and awareness. But what is how do we delineate responsiveness and awareness? We can ask patients when they are conscious and aware, but when a patient isn't really responding, how do we truly know unless we're in their own internal state? So the ICU has been a central part of my professional experience relating to all of this. Patients present with brain injuries, and it is common for them to be in a comatose state. In neurocritical care, our first principles are in relation to neuroprotection. All the guidelines that exist in neurocritical care advise against early prognostication. The first goal that we have is to stabilize and protect the cells of the nervous system. That's the first thing we do. The foundation of our neuromonitoring and critical care interventions in the early days, typically the first 72 hours, are focused on the concept of neuroprotection. There comes a time, however, where we are required to start asking questions about neurologic prognosis, start thinking about it. Our palliative care teams are instrumental at eliciting from caregivers regarding what values and attributes that families have in their hopes toward a neurologic recovery, a good neurologic recovery. In patients with coma, this oftentimes comes down to asking about questions regarding consciousness, whether their loved one will, quote unquote, wake up. But it can also be more nuanced into questions surrounding their capacities, the level of agency and ability that they have, that their loved one will have the ability to recover too. As neurologists, our fundamental process of evaluating consciousness has always relied on the neurologic exam. The neurologic exam has been our historical tried and true method of trying to elicit outward responses from a patient in order to derive an understanding of the more intrinsic nature of neurologic disease. Like detective work, we perform our exam, we observe a set of normal and abnormal phenomena in the body. We started to create conjecture, combining all of our knowledge of human physiology and our observations of what we see from the patient regarding what is wrong with them. From this, we may start to come up with a differential diagnosis. We kind of test our hypotheses out, and we'll perform other tests, things like an MRI or EEG, that may help garner a more comprehensive and more complex understanding of what is going on with the patient. We have to acknowledge, though, that our exploration of consciousness through the neurologic exam does remain insufficient in terms of completely understanding what is the conscious experience. It does not overcome the issues put forth by our predecessors in the metaphysical realm in terms of describing what is being gone through, what that conscious experience is. We can extract a lot from the neurologic exam, but we're limited toward understanding whether the patients that are in front of us are at capacity of demonstrating what Rene Descartes said as a self-evident truth. I think, therefore I am. So how do we go as clinicians from and psychologists, philosophers, and whatnot to taking consciousness from this physical concept to a more rigid science? We've been doing this in medicine. We have textbooks and literature that have really helped and guided us in terms of practically using this information and critically using this information to solve the problems that we need to solve as clinicians. So Plum and Posner have their famous textbook, Diagnosis of Stupor and Coma. All of our fellows our neurological care fellows get a copy of this book during their fellowship. And this book describes, the latest edition of this book classifies consciousness as a state of full awareness of the self and one's relationship to the environment. And our primary concepts to the contemporary science of consciousness, particularly in the medical setting, have to do with a couple of key components. One is vigilance, or the state of wakefulness. We think of this in terms of arousal, attention, our ability to focus our mental resources on specific pieces of information, and conscious access, our ability to attend to information that enters our awareness and becomes reportable to others. So, and this is what oftentimes gets categorized as content. So, let's see here. So there are a number of theories of consciousness that do exist. Some of which have more research and more rigidness in terms of psychological and physiologic research that back them up than others. This is a book. This is an article from Nature from last year that kind of goes over does a brief overview of some of these theories. There's higher order theories that exist that tell us that when humans become conscious of something, such as a visual stimulus, it is made part of a representation in higher order parts of the brain, and that those processes synthesize content from other parts of the brain. There is recurrent processing theory, which is a claim that conscious visual perception, or some sort of perception that exists, requires a loop of information from higher order cognitive areas to lower order sensory areas, which represent top-down signaling, and that mental processing and conscious experience can also go the other way around, bottom-up signaling from lower order cognitive areas to higher order. In terms of where we have a greater degree of rigidness in terms of psychological and neurophysiological experiments, particularly over the last 50 to 60 years. There are two theories that really have emerged as the most strongest and are really tested the most. So one of these is something we call information integration theory. There's a number of investigators at University of Wisconsin who've really helmed a lot of experiments regarding this theory. So information integration theory attempts to account not only for whether consciousness exists, but what are the elements to what we call its quality. It looks at the essential properties of consciousness. It breaks them down into those components that are intrinsic, specific, unitary, definite, and structured. In information integration theory, it tries to break these down into physical structures where the brain consists of nodes and networks that have causal distinctions and relations to each other. The feeling of every experience is accounted for a cause and effect structure between these nodes and networks. Much of the experiments that have been done in using information integration theory suggest that the posterior cerebral cortex is really core and essential for what we have as conscious experience. The prefrontal areas contribute to higher level experiences, but like abstract concept formation or task preparation, but the quality of the experience is really intrinsic to the posterior regions of the brain. These regions sort of put themselves together to give us to contribute to experiences like how we recognize faces, contours, colors, so forth. Oftentimes they use the example of the experience of describing the Mona Lisa being a conscious experience that requires a unique integration of networks involving the posterior cerebral cortex. So synchrony between synchrony between the specific units provide high and low levels of conscious experience. So information integration theory has gotten a lot of research along this realm. The other area that is pretty key is global neuronal workspace theory, and I'm going to talk a lot. I'm going to bring applications of this more to the next part of my slides. Global neuronal workspace theory was developed by a computational neuroscientist, Stanislas Dehaene, in Paris, France, and it looks. And unlike information integration theory, global neuronal workspace theory looks at consciousness from a computational perspective with experiments that demonstrate both the depths of subliminal as well as conscious processing. It's based on the concept that consciousness is information broadcasting, where subliminal processing and then conscious awareness of thoughts and awareness and recognition of stimuli do activate more of the prefrontal areas and the frontoparietal cortices, with a greater emphasis of that more so than information integration theory does. So you have all of these different theories, and this is often brought together by the idea. There is something that's known as the parable of the blind man and the elephant. The idea here is that you have if a bunch of blind individuals are feeling an elephant, they're thinking that they think they know what they're experiencing. They feel the tail and they think it's a rope. They feel the trunk and they feel it's a snake. They feel like they feel different components and they think they know what they're feeling. And there's validity in they're not wrong in the sense of what they feel is part of what the truth is. But when you're limited to seeing the whole picture, you don't get the whole picture. And so this is, when it comes to the models of consciousness, we can think back to a famous quote from George E. Box. This is paraphrased, that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so when it comes to these different models of consciousness, it's unlikely that any of these are necessarily right or wrong, or one is going to win versus the other. But it is it's taking what information we gather that is valid, that is empirically tested and shown to have some accuracy to it, and allowing it to increase our level of explanatory knowledge to what consciousness is. So, I want to put a focus on global neuronal workspace theory because this is an area where neurophysiologic research is really moving forward and where we've done work. Excuse me. So when it comes to global neuronal workspace theory, we have stimuli to us that are subliminal and conscious, and it is an idea represented in the activation or the ignition of neuronal activity that goes just from processing information to being aware of it. So here, invisible words or subliminal representations of words could be recognized by the temporal lobe, by Heschel's gyrus, but you may hear it and not necessarily recognize it. You may have heard it subliminally, but once it's provided with enough strength and of stimulation, whether it's how loud it is or how long you experience that stimuli, then at some point you reach a threshold of ignition where you get global workspace ignition, and then you become conscious of aware of it. So, here's just an example: the visual cortex in subliminal processing. If you see something very subtly, you just may activate the visual cortex, temporal-occipital cortices, temporoparietal cortices. You may not, if somebody tries to have you recall this actively, what you saw, you may not be able to see it, but yet there was some cellular activity that occurred. We kind of know this in terms of looking at like P100s or SSEPs or other things where we get these evoke responses that just tell us that a part of the cortex is a connection to the cortex is there, but it's not telling us that you're consciously aware of it. But once we ignite the frontoparietal, we provide frontoparietal network activation from the parietal cortex to the prefrontal cortex. We initiate higher levels of cellular activity and network activation, and then that is what makes us consciously aware. So that's the idea of global neural workspace theory. I'm gonna step away from it for a moment. I'm gonna come back to it. So don't forget what I mentioned here. We use resting state activity to be able to understand conscious activity, and this kind of goes back to part of the information integration theory, or things that kind of are what are energy, what describes sort of our qualitative experience of consciousness, as well as what is the energy. What are sort of the substrates that are necessary to have conscious experience, or in global neural workspace theory is like conscious experiences or awareness of stimuli. So we have to have a substrate of network activity that's there. So resting state functional magnetic resonance imaging has been used to sort of identify this, where we look at intrinsic functional brain network. There have been studies that have been able to sort of delineate in patients with chronic disorders of consciousness whether they're in minimally conscious or vegetative states based on the degree of network integrity that's there. There's also work using EEG, resting state EEG. So there is EEG power spectra when you look at it across frequencies. So we typically think of quantitative EEG in the time domain, where we look at it across time. But if you take a period of time and you look at it across frequencies, you take the power of activity, look at it across frequencies, you get different power spectra. And those power spectra have been shown to be associated with the degree of functional corticothalamic integrity. So when you have a complete deafferentation of corticothalamic activity, you just have a very bland power spectra chart. But as soon as you start to develop an increase in power in specific frequency bandwidths, particularly in the 5 to 9 hertz range, you may have evidence of some severe deafferentation of corticothalamic network activity, but it still could have intrinsic oscillations. If you also have a little frequency bump here in the 20 to 35 hertz range, that's a thought that you have bursting of corticothalamic activity. And then when these are more sharp and delineated, you have evidence of a pretty good corticothalamic activity that you see in healthy individuals. So this has been studied as a way to sort of investigate for the degree of complexity and corticothalamic activity that we can understand in EEG patients with disorders of consciousness. There's other forms of resting state EEG that are being studied and emerging. People are looking at information sharing indices such as Kolmogorov complexity or weighted symbolic mutual information. These are things that you can compute using MATLAB or Python, not necessarily available in FDA-approved proprietary software like Persist. You also can look at alpha band connectivity and alpha coherence, which you can see, and you actually can measure those with research licenses that Persist. In 2006, when we talk about task-based activity that's there, this has really emerged over the last 20 years. The first major paper came in 2006 in Science, where Adrian Owen and his group had published evidence that there were select patients in vegetative states who showed evidence that their premotor cortex and supplemental motor cortex areas could activate when asked to perform tennis, when asked to perform to pretend like they're playing tennis. So this was sort of our first 2006, our first kind of physiologic evidence, or that some patients that appear completely unresponsive actually have the ability to recognize commands and act upon them. And then flash forward a decade later, over the last decade, we've particularly in the adult world, we've been able to translate this, particularly in patients who are in more of an acute phase of injury. So Brian Edelow and his group at Massachusetts General had published a cohort of patients with traumatic brain injury who did show evidence of recognition of music and motor imagery of language processes in traumatic brain injury, with some evidence suggesting that they have favorable outcomes. In 2019, Jan Klaas and his group at Columbia University published this study in New England Journal of Medicine, where they showed that using our basic EEG 10 to 20 electrode system in our ICUs, that they were able to identify in a cohort of adults with acute brain injury in the ICU setting that 15% of them had EEG changes that were similar to those in healthy control when asked to squeeze their hand or not squeeze their hand. And these were patients who were otherwise completely unresponsive. And so, showing this demonstrated that they have what we refer to as cognitive motor dissociation, the ability to recognize commands and try to act on them, even though they appear outwardly completely unresponsive. And there have been, this study as well as follow-up longitudinal study that were published in Lancet have shown that within this cohort that those who had this response on EEG were more likely to have a favorable outcome. Now, the technique that they do here is a machine learning technique. So they're not necessarily looking for a very specific biomarker that you can look, call, and classify and investigate for in a hypothesis-driven method, but more this is a support vector machine classifier that was able to sort of categorize these patients as being conscious or not. And I bring that up because machine learning is going to be an important part of kind of the latter end of this talk. All right, I'm going to shift back to global neuronal workspace theory. So, because I think this is important, particularly as it relates to children. So, children, not all our kids are going to follow commands, especially from voices that are unrecognizable to them or not their parents, or just lack the maturity at a given point. Also, for patients with developmental disabilities, with autism, with developmental delays, they may not, they're less likely going to follow really complex commands, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not conscious. We kind of know that taking care of these kids. So what are the ways we can extrapolate and make these theories clinically useful? So, going back to global neuronal workspace theory, we can extract both both unconscious and conscious experiences and experimentally test for it, evaluating it, particularly using neuroimaging or EEG. So here's just an experiment where a child is asked to shown several visual cues on a screen and is asked to recognize a number. So there's a bunch of when a number is shown. So they're shown a combination of letters and letters and numbers. Some of the letters don't represent an actual word and don't recognize the word of a number. But if you look here, when the letters representing 1 is shown, it's shown for just 43 milliseconds. And the child may not recognize that at a conscious level. However, they may experience this conscious activation on an event-related potential. So they're subconsciously recognizing it, and we can evaluate that on, EEG activity, but we can't. But the child may not recognize it because it's subliminal or unconscious to them. And then when we provide the number 9, and with a greater, now providing a greater stimulus, by that this is going to be on the screen for 200 milliseconds, not 43, then we get a response execution where the child actually recognizes it. And this response happens a lot, later post, after the stimulus. So, and with a higher amplitude. So this sort of reflects to us how we can pick up subliminal and conscious experiences using EEG activity. So, and this has been looked at in infants and children and babies, looking at faces of different visual cues, and then faces of their mother. There's a pediatric neurologist in Europe, actually Stanis Lehane's wife, Ghislaine Dehane, does a lot of work on this, and in young infants and babies, and have shown this sort of ignition response, being there, not being there, subliminal recognition as well, with different amplitudes and latencies as compared to what we see in sort of the older children or adult population. So this stuff is there, and it can be experimentally tested. And just to take a step away from medicine, this stuff is entering other parts of our world. So the FBI and other groups are using things that are called brain fingerprinting or concealed information testing. These are the methods that they're trying to develop are ones where they try to harness these event-related potentials, looking for the subliminal responses. So say a victim or a criminal was at a scene of crime, and they may not, they may have PTSD, or they may not recognize something, or they may be manipulated, they may be lying. But if they are shown a visual cue, shown an individual that's there, an item that was at the scene of the crime, and can people actually recognize, can people be physiologically assessed to be evaluated for whether they have a response that they actually recognize that? So this stuff is getting a little Orwellian at times, but with the science, but it's emerging, it's improving, it's getting better. It's probably going to be used outside of medicine before it's used in medicine, just because the level of rigor that's demanded outside of the medical system is a lot less than what's demanded in the medical system. So, we may first be seeing this stuff emerge and develop outside of the clinical environment, and not necessarily for, if you can argue, not necessarily for good things, but we'll get to that. Let's go back into the ICU. With children or adults who appear who we have suspicion for covert consciousness, we can do certain types of testing to get at this subliminal and conscious processing. And so this is what is called the global, local global paradigm. It is developed from a, this is developed using the global neuronal workspace theory hypothesis, where you play tones and you change the pattern of those tones in a manner that you can look for what's called a local effect, what is often referred to as the mismatch negativity, as well as the and that occurs about 120 to 200 seconds post stimulus with a sort of a negative potential. And then there's also the global effect, where you find a stimulus 300 seconds. You find an event-related potential 300 seconds after the stimulus. These are lower amplitude and much longer in duration as compared to our traditional sort of evoke potentials that we think about, like the P100, the N20s, the and so forth, that are used clinically in intraoperative monitoring, and sometimes in clinical care that you may order. This is a lot smaller of responses in terms of amplitude. These are a lot longer in terms of when they occur, but they are thought to represent that the global effect, the P300 is thought to represent frontoparietal network activation. The mismatch negativity, representative of unconscious processing, is thought to represent sort of temporal activation or in a setting of subliminal processing. So we did some work on this back in like 2020, 2021. We're still working on publishing it, so it's not out yet, but we looked at a cohort here at Phoenix Children's. We looked at 14 healthy children in the epilepsy monitoring unit, and we looked at 30 comatose children in the pediatric intensive care unit, where we provided them with the local global oddball paradigm where they were unresponsive in the ICU. And what we found is that there is, it's rare to pick up the responses. It's not common, but when it's there, in our single center cohort, patients did well. Their Glasgow outcome pediatric scores were low, were close to normal, 12 months post injury. Now there were patients who did not have responses who did go on to do quite well. So and this is sort of in line with some of the research that's been shown with Jan Klassen's work with the motor command following in adults. Patients who have a response tend to do well. When it comes to an absence of response, there are a number of patients who don't have a response but do well. Now, we don't know why. It could be because of a lack of attention. It could be because of sedation and tons of covariates in the ICU. It probably has to do with that. So, whenever this type of work, this is all going to need more validation in the future, but whatever this type of work does enter the clinical domain, it's going to be important to sort of understanding what confounding variables are there and making sure that not too much is made out of a false negative result. When we look at amplitudes and latencies of these responses, we can see clear differences between healthy controls and patients with a coma who did well and patients with a coma who did poorly. There are clear differences, and this kind of delineates, the potential that rehab, to try to track these markers over time, potentially as a benchmark through the rehabilitative process to seeing how well patients can recover or have the potential to recover. We've been funded through the Pediatric Epilepsy Research Foundation to do a multi-center study that is ongoing, where we try to validate this across a larger multi-center cohort. So we're collecting data right now across 5 different centers, including ourselves, Texas Children's, St. Louis Children's, Children's Hospital Wisconsin, and Children's National. We're also working with Jan's group at Columbia University to do motor command testing and have those analyzed similar to as in his New England Journal paper. So we hope there'll be studies to, we first hope we can eventually publish our first study that, we collected data 3-4 years ago, and then, at some point, show some finding out of this multi-center cohort. So that all remains in process. Now there are therapies that there's a host of therapies that exist that involve the brain networks that we have discovered through this is all in line with the model that I described, whether it be global information workspace theory or information integration theory. The idea is, do we have therapies that can activate some of these regions of the brain to be able to help recover from various disorders of consciousness? So we have they're emerging, we oftentimes in the ICU may test what people call coma cocktail, where you try things like amantadine, methylphenidate, nighttime zolpidem as a paradoxical reaction. There's some case reports on that. Some of that trying to get at frontal or striatal sort of networks. You also have work being done right now using transmagnetic stimulation, using the perturbational complexity index as a marker for sort of investigating for consciousness and trying to provide therapeutic rehabilitation using TMS. And there's also centrothalamic stimulation, which I'll mention in a little bit, that's merging the concept. So this is from a Nature article a couple of years ago by Brian Edlow and Jan Klassen, where they went through kind of overall what the pharmacological studies are. I'm happy to send this, or I have this on SharePoint, and I'm happy to send this to others who we want to take a look at it. Amantadine, methylphenidate, apomorphine, zolpidem have all been studied. And then, in terms of neuromodulation, you have case reports and case series regarding deep brain stimulation, direct current stimulation, or TMS, vagal nerve stimulation, and some forms of sensory stimulation as a way to help patients potentially recover from consciousness. Most of this is not in the clinical domain still, but the data is getting get better and better. This is work from a colleague of mine, Ayam Alkakram at University of Miami. When he was at Columbia University, did this interesting cohort study. I mentioned before the ABCD model, where we look at EEG as related to power spectra. So he took patients with acute brain injuries who were prescribed amantadine and showed that in those patients who had a response over a several week period, you could concordantly see a change in their EEG power spectra, reflecting evolution from complete or severe deafferentation toward healthy corticothalamic function. So we may be able to use EEG activity, or resting EEG activity, or potentially resting functional magnetic resonance imaging modality, to be able to look at therapeutic benefit, when we can follow the degree of corticothalamic integrity over time. Now, I want to move a little bit into the neuromodulation, because some of this is kind of the emerging future of where we're going with treatment of consciousness. So this was a paper in Nature published in 2021, I believe, from Nico Schiff. They did a phase there. This is out of the Brain Mind Institute in Cornell University, and they did a phase 1 feasibility study on a small group of adults with chronic disorders of consciousness, where they provided deep brain stimulation to the central lateral thalami. So here they showed evidence that they could through stimulation, they could see, they had proof of concept that they could see activation of cortico evoked potentials as a result of stimulating the central lateral thalami for these patients. And they had some reasonable evidence to suggest when they performed repetitive stimulation to the central lateral thalami, they had an improvement in behavioral outcome scores. So this sort of set the proof of concept that central lateral thalami, and this came from a case report that they had done previously. They evolved from that case report toward this phase 1 randomized feasibility study, where they showed that this is something that can be done, that has some physiologic responses, that has some signal of some sort of signal of behavioral response change, and may set up the precedent that this work can be done at a higher level in the future. Last year, Last year, in New England Journal, they published, this was a study that was published using brain-computer interface. This is out of the BrainGate organization, where they show, out of Massachusetts General. They've been doing brain-computer interface work for quite a while, and what they've been starting to show, and this is here in a cohort of patients with ALS, this one's actually, I think this is a case report. They've been collecting a number of patients with either ALS or locked-in syndrome from spinal cord injury. They've been able to put microelectrodes in the primary motor cortex or precentral gyrus, and be able to help those patients to find ways of communicating using a screen. So this is just a video of what they showed. I'll just play it for a moment. Now, this patient can't speak, but they're going to bring the words together, and you're going to hear what they put together.
Thing that's really expensive.
Yeah, so this is just an example of kind of the audio when they're able to use a screen to move a cursor. Like, they can get at what they can try to start to put the words together if they have the right visual cue and screen, and then this is a proof of concept to see if they can be able to communicate better. So there's a lot of work out of industry right now, particularly really focused on the ALS population. It's adults and it's those with severe neuromuscular disease who have intact cortices, pretty healthy cortices, that using large language model, using AI neural circuitry, be able to help patients over time move things on a screen and be able to start to communicate. I don't have slides here on it, but there is ongoing work also that relates to patients with severe aphasia, out of University of Michigan, with severe aphasia out of with stroke, where they're trying to do this as well. As many of you may know, the Neuralink has been enrolling a number of patients at our neighbor at BNI, to do similar work as well. So this area is really emerging and getting better and better. Let's talk a little bit about children. I had the chance. I was at the pediatric neurovascular conference in Aspen last week, and I had a chance to meet Adam Curtin, who's a pediatric neurologist at the University of Calgary, who presented this phenomenal presentation. Over there they have they've established a brain-computer interface for program for children. So they have in their rehabilitation unit, they are working with children with cerebral palsy as well as severe brain injuries who are in the ICU that experience severe disability. And they have used a pretty non-invasive brain BCI system. This is the emotive headset. It measures just a very small amount of electrodes, but their program is one where they have a neurologist at the lead. They have rehab members as well, and they have engineers that focus time and energy in the rehab unit to be able to take the neurologic signals that come out of the emotive system and allow children to play a game or to move a wheelchair. And these are pretty elemental. They're kind of dichotomous systems where it's like go, no go sort of systems. They're not, with non-invasive monitor BCI, you're not able to get at the level that you can start to speak like with an intracortical microelectrode, but still families and children find a lot of pleasure in being able to even do dichotomous things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do with their body. So this stuff is emerging, it's coming about. It's not all not here. It's not all completely in the future. People are working on this with adults, and people are working with this, doing this in form for another with children. So there's a lot to see here. Now, there's a lot of things that have to do with ethics in terms of all of this. It is important to think about. So, I think we're challenged by normative, what are if we pick up, with those patients where we see signs of covert consciousness, what is, what's the significance of it for patients and their families, and what do we do with this information? What do we do with information that's not completely validated yet, but families want to know, and do they have a right to know? And how careful do we need to be about discussing positive or negative results? I think right now the best the questions arise. There's a lot of great articles in terms of the ethics, in terms of who's actually doing this. When it comes to publication, high-level publications, I think we have work from, the Massachusetts General has described, and earlier this year, their clinical implementation of using fMRI and EEG to look for cognitive motor dissociation in their hospital. Now, they've done extensive research over a decade. They still operate with some guidance from the IRB, but they do this, and they do it clinically. And this is just a great article to sort of see what are the challenges that they have. They readily admit that they're working with non-FDA approved technology and software that they've developed expertise in. They have a host of engineers and other members that help provide ancillary services. But so they are pretty resourced. They have high resources to do this. But there's a lot that we can learn from them. So in terms of how this can be done and how can be done, as appropriately and safely as possible. They do acknowledge that, given that their techniques are not, using FDA-approved devices or FDA-approved software, that this is not what they can do. It should not be deployed across multiple institutions, but sort of proof of concept, and then how an individual institution can develop their own pathway toward this type of stuff. So, and then let's just take a moment, how do we, let's get back to the metaphysics a little bit. Like, how do we know if somebody's truly conscious? Our theories for empirical testing and awareness and consciousness are there, but since we're still limited by describing phenomenal awareness. And the Jed McKenna's of the world will still argue, despite all of our empirical testing and scientific knowledge that we've gathered, that the only consciousness we can truly know is our own. So we have to recognize that activation of brain to familiar voices, novel stimuli may suggest cortical processing, but what does it mean in terms of determining the state of sentience that you have? What does it mean to have covert cortical processing? Let's say if you don't have the signatures of vigilance, what if your brain activates to a novel sound with that, but you don't have, but you have destroyed sleep spindles and no evidence of vigilance? These are questions that we that are going to be interesting to sort of to try to grasp at when we're doing all this. So, and how do we know that a negative test is truly negative? When it comes to some of the stuff I talk about, subliminal messaging, if we can detect subliminal messaging and overt science, attentional signatures of consciousness, we need to think about when volition occurs. This is going to be important in terms of ethics, agency. This is a scene I don't know if the younger people have watched. I don't know how young people here are, but if you watch the movie Minority Report, you know the idea that it's a sci-fi novel where we think about what where somebody's thoughts are able to be recorded and then thought crimes are able to be observed. And the story sort of elicits the ethics of what it means to be able to detect thoughts before a person actually does something. I think we're not fully at that realm, but if you look at that concealed information testing that the FBI wants to do, this stuff is emerging. It's people want to do this, and we got to know what that means. And then I think in the realm of artificial intelligence is sort of how do we know who or what has consciousness? I think this field is rapidly evolving. There's concepts of artificial intelligence, artificial generalized intelligence, and people and artificial superintelligence. People don't know what these things mean necessarily. They know that things are getting better. Technology is getting better and better. In certain processes are exceeding the capacity of humans in terms of certain ability to attend to and recognize information. But many you can argue that this isn't necessarily what it is still not evolving into what it means to be human in terms of what we think about. A lot of people argue that artificial generalized intelligence is what it is the type of AI that a human has. We don't have AGI right now, and what is it that makes us distinct and unique that's really at that. I think that's a long topic that I don't think I have the time to go into right now as I'm looking at the time, but it's something to think about. So with the conclusion, I want to sort of end with two statements. Just I'm going to not show a bullet point. I'm just going to put two phrases out there that are a little bit that are provocative. But I think about them. One is what you heard already. Rene Descartes, cogito ergo sum. Like we know how. This is the one thing that we can say. I think, therefore I am. So one thing we can say and we can recognize as a self-evident truth. Everything else is empirical reasoning, testing, and helping us with better explanation for the problems we solve. But it's at a different domain, and we're still the metaphysical philosophers around us still look at what we do and they still come back to this as the only real truth. So I think what separates us is what we do and why we do it, and it's fundamentally to help people and to solve problems for the patients around us. And then the other thing I'll just mention, this may be a little off topic, but I think this is a provocative quote that I think a lot. This is from Robert A. Heinlein, a sci-fi author. Specialization is for insects. I think this is something that people don't, this is not advice or something that anybody's told me in terms of my own professional development, but I think it's actually really important. It's a really important phrase in a world where we're going toward, AI and, just automation, doing a lot of what we do, and also just in terms of consciousness. And I think the one thing I'll mention is I think when I prognosticate a patient, like there's a part of me that's an insect, there's a part of me that's really good at what I do as an insect. I know the data. I know what guidelines exist. I know what's the level of evidence for an EEG biomarker, an MRI biomarker, what's the sensitivity and specificity to what sort of pediatric cerebral performance category scores will be there at 6 months. I can do all that. What am I challenged by when I prognosticate? It's not that. It's recognizing when a parent asks whether the child is going to wake up or not, what they're really asking me for. It's recognizing their nonverbal cues. It's a desire to communicate uncertainty in situations where nobody wants to hear uncertainty, and you feel both pressure from the family as well as pressure of the patients to provide information. We're asked to sort of bring information, very complex information, down to the level of our patients, and we try the best we can do that. But at some points, are we are we doing it well? Are we doing it appropriately? Are we at risk of taking vulnerable patients and manipulating them? These are the parts that are really hard. And these are the things that require other disciplines, require an understanding of ethics, an understanding of psychology, and other parts of what we do, beyond our insects expertise. So with that, I'll stop. I know it's the top of the hour, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Hey, Brian, this is Corwin. Really enjoyed listening to your talk today. I don't know if you happen to see the New York Times article that talked about people who were pronounced brain dead for organ transplantation, but they weren't truly dead at the time. I don't know. I kind of peripherally related to your discussion today about what is consciousness, but any thoughts about how we're going to use these tools to give kind of useful information that's so critical to things like transplant medicine?
Yeah, that's a I have not, thank you for that question, Corbin. I have not seen that article. I'll have to take a look at it. With the brain death world, it's like it's extremely vital. I'll have to take a look at it because I haven't taken a look at it. I mean, it's the brain in the brain death world, the critical thing in the literature is that we are all doing appropriate brain death testing to when you do it appropriately, we're pretty good. We're good at not at finding patients who have death by neurologic criteria, who are not going to show recovery of neurologic function. There are cases where when brain death testing is not performed appropriately, where that is the case. So, we follow we have new guidelines on brain death by neurologic criteria, or brain death, that have been cut out over the last 2 years or so, endorsed by AAN and Child Neurology Society. We've changed our guidelines and our protocol and checklist to match that. And I think if you do that, to my knowledge, I haven't read this article, but to my knowledge, if you do it appropriately, you're not going to run into that issue. Do things happen in the community? Yes, they do, if things are not tested appropriately. There also is the topic of, brain activity versus brain function. And that's where, death by neurologic criteria is supposed to represent not necessarily a loss of all brain cells, but an irreversible loss of brain function. And so, that's where, so those are just my thoughts on that. I'll caveat it with the fact that I haven't read the article that you mentioned.
Yeah, hey Brian, I
Yep.
loved it,
Thank you.
as I'm sure you would have expected me to love it. But I have a question. So, this is what I wrestle with. So let's say you want to shift towards therapeutics and you want to intervene to restore consciousness where consciousness does not exist. Where is the sliding bar of moral and ethical propriety when you could potentially do something that could restore the most basic elements of consciousness, but not get a patient to the point where they can interact or change their environment? And then the question becomes, is that torture? Is that torture of the patient? So like you take a patient who's completely unconscious. Let's say you can implant them with a neurostimulator device that gets them to open their eyes and at least restore an awareness, a functional awareness of their environment, but yet their ability to communicate, their ability to move, their ability to change, variables in their environment remains limited. I mean, how do you even assess that a patient would consent you to that? Because they wouldn't be the ones obviously consenting to that therapy. It would be their loved ones, it would be their family. I think there's like a huge, I don't know the answer to this, or you may will answer in the next minute or two, but how do we approach that? How do we even systematically approach that?
Thank you, Jay. That's a great question. And I think it's an important one. And it's part of us being able to delineate what consciousness is and what are the energies, what are the biologic substrates and the neural correlates to consciousness and what they each are, and then having to integrate philosophy and ethics and psychology all into the biology. So you are correct. I mean, so Nico's shift work with the phase one central lateral thalamic stimulation, that is trying to get at arousal mechanisms, right? It's trying to take a patient who is not arousing and get them to arouse. It's, the hope is that they have all the other networks that the global neuronal, workspace is going to work. It's going to, and the posterior, with the information integration theory, that the posterior circuitry is going to work, and you're going to have those cause and effect relationships to give you the qualia or of a conscious experience. But we don't know if that'll happen. And I think there's also the injury. If you have cortical thalamic activity there, but extensive cortical damage, you can end up where you described, where you might be able to recover arousal mechanisms, but nothing more than what we think of as human. And again, what do we think of as human? I mean, that's where you can get into the whole realm of concept formation, of creativity and innovation, of whatever it is that makes us distinct from another sentient system. So that's the hard question. And I think if I had a crystal ball of what this will look like in medicine, I think it'll look like epilepsy surgery, where you like actually surgery planning. What do? You get a neuropsychologist involved, you get a number of different players involved, you get a electrophysiologist, you get a surgeon, you get everybody involved, you think about comprehensively the different elements of the overall quality of life, from the biologic substrate to up to the parts of somebody who they are, and then you have that discussion as a multidisciplinary group. I mean, that's the best model I can think of. Just thinking about how we think about epilepsy surgery is, I think this stuff is going to be a similar realm. You got to get all the disciplines involved and think about all the different components. And then be able to break down, the different components of consciousness: arousal, concept formation, the qualia, and then what matters to the patient. All right. Well, I hope you all enjoy this. I know we're going over time, but thank you. It's been a pleasure. And you guys all have a great day.
Thank you, Brian.